Good evening. I'm Peter Kariva, the CEO of the Aquarium of Pacific, and I'm welcoming you to our first Wednesday lecture series. This is our third of these first Wednesdays. Before turning to tonight's very cool program, I just wanted to alert you to the next first Wednesday, which is a little bit different. It's June 2nd. It's not going to be live in person like this is. It's a film screening, and it's for the High Tide High School Film Festival. It's a pretty astonishing collection of films, and you'll be able to tune into it and watch it virtually. Very, very different evening, but some pretty cool films. So tonight it's Erin McCombs, and she's going to be talking to us about sharks. I don't want to take time away from her other than to say she has a master's in marine and environmental biology from USC. She's been in education here for 10 years. She writes, when we asked about her background, that she originally thought she wanted to do research. She ended up in informal education as a way of doing conservation. I think it's a very good choice, but you've ended up doing research as well. In my old line of work, the best researchers are the best teachers, and the best teachers are the best researchers. And everybody loves, I shouldn't say everybody loves sharks, but sharks compel us. That's why we have Shark Weeks, Shark Nights, kids run, and the first thing they want to see is sharks. The one thing I do want to say that's a little bit off topic from sharks, but the type of volunteer science that Erin's going to be talking about is the future of conservation. It's being used around the world with improved imaging and technology. It's used to get ivory poaching. It's used to find illegal landfills. It's used to find invasive trees in Hawaii. It can identify ships, fishing vessels with enslaved crew. And it's a combination of imaging, sometimes machine learning and artificial intelligence, but always in the end, a lot of volunteers looking at images. And you're going to see it more and more in conservation. And Erin, I'm excited to hear what you have to tell us about sharks.
All right, well, thank you. Like Peter said, I'm here tonight to talk about an aquarium-involved project that we've been working on with Global FinPrint since 2017, and then talk about some of the recent findings that we've had and the conservation implications that those have. So we'll go ahead. All right. So first off, I want to take a second to talk about the role of sharks. So sharks play this critical role within our ecosystems. They are an apex predator. And what we find with apex predators is that they play this role at basically maintaining the biodiversity of the habitats that they are in. Scientists aren't exactly sure what that looks like for sharks. There's a lot of ideas of what it could look like. One of those ideas is that they help to basically prevent overgrazing of seagrass habitats because they'll feed on the animals that feed on the seagrass. It's also thought that they could prevent coral reefs from becoming covered in algae by, again, maintaining those levels within the food chain. So they play this role as an apex predator. They're also an important member of the cleanup crew of the ocean. So they feed on diseased and dying fish. So they help to keep fish populations really robust and healthy. So they're important for that purpose. And then finally, they're important for tourism. So there are a lot of coastal communities that depend on sharks for ecotourism and scuba diving and all of the money that brings into their economy. Some studies estimate that each individual shark could be worth as much as $1 million per year. And then if that same shark is caught for fishing, it's worth about $100. So they have this really large economic influence on those countries. Now, despite all of this, sharks are facing threats around the globe. Sharks are threatened primarily by overfishing and unsustainable fishing practices, and they're especially susceptible to that because they have the biology that basically they take a long time to reach reproductive age, and then once they've reached reproductive age, they have very few young at a time. So they're especially susceptible to overfishing where we fish them faster than they can replace themselves, and then they're caught as bycatch, so as unintended catch as well. Now, looking at a closer look of those of those numbers. This is from the IUCN Red List, their most recent assessment in 2019, and this is the global status of sharks and rays. So we have the green wedge, that's about 30% of shark species, and that's the least concerned. So these are the ones that are not currently at risk of extinction. And then we have all those varying red wedges, and those are the ones that are currently at some level of extinction risk. So all the way from near threatened all the way up through critically endangered. But the really interesting wedge that we're going to be talking about more tonight is that 42%, the data deficient. So this is the group that we don't know enough about these shark and ray species to know where they fall within this spectrum. And that's what brings us to our Global FinPrint project. So Global FinPrint is the world's largest reef, shark, and ray survey that's ever been done. And it looked at 58 countries. It studied 371 reefs and took 4 years. The aquarium got involved with this project back in 2017. I went on a donor-sponsored trip to Belize where it was an Earthwatch trip. I'm not sure if anyone out there is familiar with Earthwatch, but basically what happens with Earthwatch is they pair volunteers with field researchers, and the volunteers provide that human power that you need to do field research. So in my instance, I went out to Belize. I spent a week at a research station 30 miles off the coast, and we spent the week catching and tagging sharks. And so you can imagine if you catch a shark and you tag the shark, you have to measure it, and you have to take a blood sample, and you have to take a tissue sample, and someone has to attach the tag. So there's all these things that need to happen, and all of that takes people. So that's where the Earthwatch volunteers come in. Now, we also were setting these underwater cameras, and then in the evenings, we would watch the cameras and see what we found. And the lead PI for the Global FinPrint project was also the field researcher that we were paired with. And so we were talking in the evenings, and he was saying that his biggest concern with this huge project that they were starting was that they might not be able to have the human power to analyze all of the data. And if you're familiar with the aquarium at all, you know that's one of the things that makes the aquarium so great, is that we have this incredible resource of all of these volunteers that are so invested in ocean conservation and so invested in the aquarium, and they just want to find ways to get involved. And I saw this as a possibility to have this union between the human power at the Aquarium of the Pacific and this massive project with Global FinPrint. So let's talk a little bit more about how we collected the data for Global FinPrint. So if you want to press play back there, I'm going to take all of you to New Caledonia. You know you were going on a tropical vacation tonight. This is New Caledonia. This particular video was collected, I think, in 2017. And I do have to say, as a disclaimer, this video is much more sharky than most of the videos that we got to watch. This is a particularly interesting one. There's lots of sharks, lots of activity happening. I figured we're all spending our Wednesday evening learning about sharks, so we might as well watch one of the most interesting ones that we saw. So basically, the way that we collect this data is we had a tool that looks like this. This is called a BRUV, a baited remote underwater video. Basically, it's this big contraption that was lowered down to the seafloor, and then there was a camera like a GoPro, and then at the end of the pole was a bait bag with 1 kilogram of fish. And you can see the bait bag is kind of like buried in the reef a little bit there. So they would lower it down, it sits on the seafloor for 60 minutes, and then they lift it back up to the surface, and someone has to analyze the video. So this is our way of being able to collect all of the data for this project. Now, the benefit of using BRUVs like this is that they're relatively inexpensive and they're really easy to replicate. So that's how they were able to sample at all of the reefs around the world, because they were able to use these videos and they were able to do a lot of them. So we ended up collecting about 15,000 hours of footage, just like this. So if you were going to sit down and watch that 15,000 hours, it would take you 2 years to watch all of that video. Now, one thing I think that people instantly ask is, what is it that we're looking for? So our volunteers were looking for sharks, stingrays, eels, and sea turtles. And then when they would swim in, they're looking to identify what species they were and count how many they are. So you might be wondering, well, how do you know you're not counting the same shark twice? What we look for is something called the max N. So that's the maximum number of individuals that were in the frame at any given time. So the max N for this particular video was 15. So we had 15 sharks in there at once. You can imagine that if you're watching this and trying to count all the sharks, you're going to be pausing it quite a bit to make sure that you're counting every tail and every nose of every shark that comes through. Now, the reason that we count the max N instead of trying to count each shark as they swim through is that we want to make sure that we are being consistent from one video to the next video. And that helps to make sure that we're not introducing any sort of bias into our data. So we might have like an excellent shark viewer who can tell exactly which shark is which and knows that this one has different markings than that one, or whatever it might be. But we want to make sure that every person that's watching that video is going to be able to come to the exact same conclusion, so we're not introducing any of that bias. So like I said, our max N for this one was 15 of the gray reef sharks in this footage. So let's take a look at who it was that actually did all this analysis. These are our volunteers that we've had here at the aquarium. We had 43 volunteers since 2017 that have participated in this project. They contributed over 4,000 hours and identified 2,681 sharks. Now, we talked about how there were 15,000 hours of video that were collected. Our volunteers viewed 1,807 of those videos. So that's over 10% of the videos that were collected were viewed just here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, which is really exciting. This group of volunteers is also the first group of non-university volunteers to be involved. So before the aquarium got involved, the people that were viewing this were all university students. And then we got this group involved, and we had middle school students, and we had grandparents, and we had retired people, and we had people doing this as a part of their day job, and we had all these different people all involved. So, before Zoom calls were cool, we all got to virtually visit French Polynesia, went to New Caledonia, the Philippines, the Cook Islands, Hawaii, Madagascar, the Maldives. We traveled all over. They saw primarily gray reef sharks, white tip reef sharks, and black tip reef sharks. So those were the three that were most commonly seen. Although we did see quite a few nurse sharks as well. We saw some pregnant tiger sharks, which was exciting. Large schools of manta rays, large schools of hammerhead sharks, even a couple scuba divers like swim by and wave hello, which was fun to get to see those. And all of this dedication from all of our 43 volunteers and then from hundreds of volunteers across the globe, all of it contributed to the world's, to a landmark study on sharks and ray conservation. And that was published in Nature in 2020, the global status and conservation potential of reef sharks. So this is the very first time that anyone has ever studied sharks around the world looking at this large of a scale using the exact same methods to collect that data. So it gives us a really great benchmark of what's happening around the globe. Now, because like we talked about, using BRUVs is inexpensive and easy to replicate, it's something that other scientists can go back and reference in the future to see how things have changed for particular species or particular regions or whatever it might be. All of the data that was collected for this survey is all part of an open access database so that scientists can use it moving forward. So let's dive into the results. So we'll start out with the good news. These are the green areas. These are the areas where we saw high abundance of sharks and high concentrations of sharks. These, the areas to really note here are Australia, the Bahamas, Federated States of Micronesia, French Polynesia, and the United States. What we found in these areas is that they are generally well governed, and they are areas that had some sort of shark regulation and protection. So in different areas, they used different methods of protecting sharks, but they all had something, and that something was what worked for them. So it could have been catch limits or gear restrictions or fishing bans or protected areas, whatever it might be, they used some sort of protection. Now, the benefit of these areas is that they can serve as refuges for other sharks. So in the incredibly complicated field of shark conservation, one benefit is that some shark species do travel between reefs. So they can serve as almost a lifeboat for sharks in other areas. It also shows us that shark conservation works, that if we are working towards shark conservation, that we can be successful in that goal, that there can be areas that have high numbers of sharks. We also found some yellow countries, we'll call them. They're the areas that are not doing great right now, but we see really high conservation potential. Those countries were Indonesia, Madagascar, Fiji, and Barbados. And so those are areas that we saw that currently have degraded populations of sharks. So there's not a ton of sharks there now. They don't have any sort of shark protection, but they do have other metrics that make them having high conservation potential. So they're areas that the scientists think that stakeholders could work together to be successful moving forward in conservation in the future. So unfortunately, though, there is some bad news too. So these are the areas where sharks were least abundant. These are the red spots. Now, overall, the study showed that sharks are functionally extinct on 20% of coral reefs around the world. So that means that on 20% of the reefs around the world, there are not enough sharks present to perform their ecosystem services that they need to do. We talked about how scientists are still working to figure out exactly what those services are, but on 20% of the reefs around the world, they're not there to do it. Looking at 6 different nations around the world, looking at in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, French West Indies and the Windward Dutch Antilles, Kenya, Vietnam, and Qatar. Looking at those 6 nations, we collected over 800 hours of video footage, and we found only 3 sharks in those 800 hours. So these are the areas where sharks desperately need help for conservation. These are areas where we've seen the huge consequences of unsustainable fishing practices. Now, this isn't the end of Global FinPrint's analysis. Our hope is to move forward and answer more questions using that same data. So that's the benefit of having this incredibly large data set. We can analyze that data set looking at different metrics to try to learn more about what's happening. So one of the things they want to learn is what's happening on those reefs where sharks are functionally extinct. Which of those ecosystem services are no longer being accomplished? So we know that on land, when you remove large land animals from a habitat, you have these really severe consequences, and sometimes they're really surprising too. So we want to see what that looks like and what might be happening when you remove sharks. We also want to look at what the best method for conserving and protecting the sharks is. So are we looking at just protecting the individual sharks, or should we be looking at protecting their entire ecosystem? And so our data will allow us to compare what's happening in countries where they protect just the shark and what's happening in countries where they're protecting the whole ecosystem, and how that is helping sharks and their numbers. And then most importantly, we want to use this data to inform conservation decisions moving forward. So the countries can compare themselves to their neighbors within their own regions and see how they're doing in comparison to their neighbors. And that can help us to motivate countries to work to change and to work to conserve. So the Global FinPrint team has already gone to the governments of several nations, and they've already started to make change. One of those is that in Belize, they developed the world's first ray sanctuary as a result of the data produced by Global FinPrint. And in the Dominican Republic, which remember is one of these red countries, they just implemented a shark and ray fishing ban to help protect their sharks and rays in that area. So I do want to talk, though, about some of the challenges of shark conservation. One of the things that we found was that the areas where sharks were functionally extinct all had these 3 things in common. They had destructive fishing practices, they had high population density, and they had poor governance. And poor governance, that's a World Bank metric. It basically looks at the levels of corruption within the government, the ability of the people to participate within the government, and things like freedom of the media. So when these 3 things exist together, we see that those are the areas where shark populations are most devastated. And those are areas where that conservation is most needed. And they're also areas where people depend on shark fishing for their livelihoods, and there's very little social safety net to help protect them. So the reason I point this out is because this really underlines the importance of the people-based, human-based approach to conservation. So looking at conservation, you can conserve in a couple different ways. One way that you can do it is through direct conservation, so having fishing regulations. And that'll help with that first point, but you also need to look at things like indirect conservation, which is looking at the socioeconomic things that impact sharks or whatever animal you're looking at. And that's something that impacts those last 2. So in order to successfully conserve sharks, we really need to use both a direct and an indirect approach to conservation, and that's going to require the work of both conservation biologists and social scientists working together through community-based conservation. So engaging the stakeholders within those communities and working with everyone within that community. So working with the fishers, working with the governments, working with the people in that region. So I've done this all tonight. It happens all the time. But we always talk about shark conservation, and we forget to talk about the rays. And that's a huge mistake. Stingrays get much, much less funding in science, in research, than sharks do. They get much less attention. We've never heard of like Discovery Channel Stingray Week or anything like that. But they are an animal that needs our help as much or even more than sharks do. In fact, when we look at the most threatened families of sharks and rays, 5 out of the 7 most threatened families are actually rays. So we're going to take a closer look at 2 of those ray families. And these are the rhino rays. This is the wedgefish and the giant guitarfish. Together, they are known as the rhino rays. And the reason I want to talk about this is because this is a really great example of how complicated shark conservation can be. So there are 16 different species of rhino rays. If you've been up to our stingray pool, you've seen our shovel-nosed guitarfish. That's not a rhino ray, but they look very similar. Basically, they look like very large versions of that. So like I said, there's 16 species. 15 of those species are critically endangered. So that's just one step above extinct. So again, 15 out of the 16 species of rhino rays are critically endangered, making them the world's most endangered marine fish. So, what is it that's putting them in this position? They are fish, they're caught as bycatch a bit, but their really main threat is that they are a targeted species. They're caught for their fins, so you can see they have those really big, beautiful fins, so they're one of the most valuable fins in the shark fin trade. But they're also caught for their meat, so their meat is consumed domestically where it's caught. Their snout, there's this gelatinous material in their snout that's consumed, and then their skin is used for like products. So because of this, they are caught in areas where, again, people are depending on sharks, and catching one of these is a really high value catch. And they're found in places where, again, people don't have that social safety net. So remember we talked about how places that have high shark abundance have good governance and they have some form of shark protection. The one species that's not critically endangered is found only in Australia. So it's an area where, again, we see that good governance and that level of shark protection. So that really underlines those findings that we found in the Nature paper. So again, I'm telling this story to help underline how complicated shark conservation can be. Because you look at this and you're like, well, we should protect them. We should ban the fishing of these animals. But that's not really something that we can do coming from the US to go into a country where people are depending on these to feed their family, and it's a part of their livelihood, it's a part of their history, it's what they've always done, and we can't just come in from the US and expect for that to change. They're protected under CITES, so there is some protection from international trade, so they're consumed primarily domestically within the countries where they're caught. So choosing sustainable seafood here in the United States, while it is incredibly, incredibly important, you should all choose sustainable seafood. It's the #1 thing you can do to help sharks and stingrays in the oceans. It doesn't have a direct impact on these. So it helps their habitat, it helps their food source, but it's not going to reduce the number of rhino rays that are fished out of the ocean. So what's the solution? I'm not telling this story again just to make you all feel hopeless. I'm telling this story because I want to underline the importance of using that interdisciplinary approach when it comes to conservation. So using social scientists, working with conservation biologists to lift up and empower the people within those communities to be able to affect real change on those populations. We've seen a lot of really successful community-based conservation projects for other endangered animals. Those don't exist yet for the rhino rays, but my hope is that as an educator, I think that the first step is kind of raising awareness and letting people know what's happening. And so my hope is that you might go out, and if one of those programs is developed in the future, that you'll be familiar already with this journey that the rhino ray is on, and be willing to support in whatever way you may see possible. Now, it is important to, again, look at that kind of intersection for that conservation biologists and social scientists working together. Now, the aquarium is not working alone in its quest to help conserve sharks and rays. We are working with groups of other shark and ray enthusiasts at other zoos and aquariums. So you know that the aquarium is part of AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and AZA has a program called SAFE, Saving Animals from Extinction. And through this program, we try to amplify the voices of zoos and aquariums by all working together. So when we all present one unified voice, we can be stronger and our reach can be much further. So I'm currently working on a committee that's developing a new conservation action plan to see how zoos and aquariums can work to conserve sharks and rays moving forward. We're looking at that conservation for the next 3 years, and we're looking at things like education and public awareness, husbandry and research, and advocacy. And so by looking at what our reach can be within those different fields, we're developing a plan for moving forward and having real changing effects on sharks and stingrays out in the oceans as well. So, anyone have any questions?
Before we'll take questions from the audience, but also if you're watching virtually, you can use the Q&A function, ask questions, and they'll get ferried up here. And while you're thinking of one, I have a really nerdy geek.
Okay.
So how many pairs of eyes were on each film segment?
3.
3.
Mm-hmm. So there would be a minimum of 2 people watching it at regular speed, and then someone confirming what they saw, basically, and watching it in faster speed, like an expert, basically, someone from the lab.
So 2 people watching it at once?
2 people, yeah.
Yeah, the statistician in me says there should have been more. But
oh, really?
how did the? I was also curious. I didn't realize that we were the first group, that was not college students. How did we do compared to them? I mean, in terms of the timing and the variance and.
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. I kept records for what our team was doing, but I'm not sure, as far as accuracy or how many views or anything like that. I'm not sure what the other teams were doing.
Having just come from teaching college, I think we did better. Okay, any from the audience? I have some from. Sure, go ahead.
I understand. We talk about conservation in Bangladesh. They talk about having a meal that day. So I understand that, and I understand the market for shark fin. This Oriental fetish for that. But a shark itself, how much meat is on a shark? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a very meaty fish to fish, but if that's all you got, I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, they're lighter than they look, definitely, but I mean, you can imagine that a 10-foot long, guitar fish or something like that is going to be a lot larger than a lot of the other fish that they're catching.
Even though there isn't a lot of meat, there's a lot of fish.
Yeah, I mean, they're big fish. Any fish that's 5 foot long is going to have a lot more food on it than a fish that's 6 inches long or 12 inches long.
Go ahead.
Do you think that one myth about poor governments is it correlated to social pressure? Like because you said that they have they're kind of more surveyed and they're not really they're more censored, right? The media. Do you think it's because they're not allowed to? They don't really have. Here we have Blackfish and documentaries like that that connect with social pressure on places like that to advocate more for the animals. Do you think that is what is?
I think probably a larger issue with that is that because they lack that social safety net, these people are really dependent on fishing for their livelihood. And if they go out and they don't catch fish, they're either not going to make money or they're not going to bring something home to put on the table for their family. So it's critically important to their life and to their survival. And there's none of that social safety net that we have here in the United States.
So I'll take a couple from the audience, for the virtual audience, I will get back to you guys. Do sharks migrate between areas, or do they stay locally where they were born?
So it just depends on the species for that one. So there's over 400 different species of sharks. Some of them spend more time on the reef where they were born. Others travel long distances. And that's part of that complicated nature of making sure that each shark is protected in the way that's best for that nation and best for that shark. So if the shark stays within the reef, then protecting the reef is going to protect the shark. But if the shark leaves the reef, then you have to protect the individual shark as well, because they're not going to be protected within the reef.
And one more from the computer is, are there any breeding programs going on for critically endangered rays?
Not the ones that we were talking about. So the ones that the rhino rays we were talking about are really understudied. That's one of the issues that they're having. In fact, 3 out of those 16 species have never been seen outside of a fish market. So they've only been seen in fish markets. So there's a lot that we don't know about them. There are a lot of really great breeding programs that are going on, though, within zoos and aquariums for sharks more. For instance, there's a lot of research on sand tiger sharks, that Dr. Adams has been involved with. There's also a really interesting project coming up. It's called the STAR Project, and you should look it up. It's really, really exciting, but it's working with zebra sharks and with a goal of hopefully eventually helping to repopulate reefs in Indonesia.
Okay,
And those are AZA,
Let's
yeah.
go back to the live audience.
There was an article in the newspaper today about sharks in our local waters and how they are approaching shore closer than most people thought. And the upshot of that article was that they've always been with us, it's just that we didn't have the coverage that we have now. Is this citizen program going to involve looking at our own sharks, not just the tropical sharks?
That's a great question. So this study is just looking at reef sharks. It's looking to find the impacts that sharks have on coral reefs, so it has not been broadened beyond that. But I think that that's a really interesting point about the sharks, about finding them more close to our coasts. We've done a. So you're laughing, Bob. But we've done a lot recently to help protect our local oceans. Things like protecting marine mammals, protecting the air, protecting the water. All of these things to improve our local habitats, and that's resulted in things like white sharks being able to exist in a place they've always existed. So that's like a success. It's like we wanted healthier oceans, we're getting healthier oceans. It shows that we're doing the right thing.
But Val, I hope we do stuff like that, because these types of questions can almost only be answered with volunteer programs. I mean, you really can't, because you've got to look at a broad area, with a lot of person power, and it's not like doing an experiment in the lab.
I know that Shark Lab uses something similar, Shark Lab at Cal State Long Beach, but they do not bait their cameras. But that's one of their methods for studying local sharks here. But that's a different project, obviously.
I've read a little bit about sharks being caught for their livers and for the squalene that's found inside their livers. A lot of that's used in like beauty products, and I think I read an article, I didn't know if it was accurate or not, about potentially using that for the vaccine for COVID. Do you guys have any information, or are you working with any sort of like against corporations who do use and extract sharks for that purpose?
I have not worked with those groups. I think you are correct. That is one of the reasons that they're fished, is for that squalene, especially for like beauty products and that sort of thing. And I think that when we're promoting people to choose sustainable seafood, I think sometimes we forget about choosing sustainable products as well, but that's definitely part of it.
You mentioned intersectionality. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But how are we going to educate more lower income areas, and how are we going to make it more socially economically fundable, especially promoting conservation? I know as somebody who comes from a lower income area, it was very hard for me to get access to higher educational systems, and especially getting a volunteership here at the aquarium. So is there any more work going towards educating the masses?
Yeah, I think that's part of our mission here at the aquarium, is to be able to educate people and to reach out into our communities. And I know that especially within the education department, that's one of our really strong goals moving forward, is to try to build relationships with everyone within Long Beach, especially to help make sure that Long Beach sees us as a resource, and that we are available to them, and that we are able to go out into that community as well.
When you mentioned earlier about turning these areas into non-fishing zones, kind of, like hope spots and stuff like that. Have you seen any issues with regulating that? Because even if you do turn it into a spot where you can't touch anything there, take anything there, like, are there people out regulating it? And,
Yeah, so I think that that's why you really need, in order to have those green spots that we looked at, those green nations, they were both well-governed and had regulations, because if you have regulations in place and they're not being enforced in any way, then they're obviously not going to work. I think a part of it also is looking at it that perhaps shark sanctuaries are developed in places where they're already protecting sharks, and sharks are already highly valued. So there is that aspect to look at as well, that if we have a shark sanctuary in a place where fishing has happened historically, how would that impact shark populations versus like a lot of Australia has a lot of like shark reserves in there in places that historically they haven't really fished very heavily for sharks. So it's definitely something to look at.
One of Eleanor Ostrom's findings, she's the first woman to win Nobel Prize in economics, was studying what made protected areas work in the marine systems. And often it was if they were in sight of the community. Because if they're not in sight of the community, they can't enforce it, and the community doesn't feel that it's part of the community. So very much the proximity mattered a lot. So that big national protected areas often didn't work at all because there's no compliance.
Interesting.
Another one, is the shark population in Hawaii healthy?
The shark population in Hawaii was not great. The numbers were pretty low in Hawaii. The U.S. did a lot better on the east coast of the U.S. than it did in the Pacific.
Other questions?
So we talked about the socioeconomic part of this, but what is the first step to fixing that? Because these are people's their livelihood, so it's like we can't really do anything because that's how they eat, that's how they make a living. So what is like the first step to helping with that part of the conservation?
So that's the beauty of community-based conservation projects, is that the people involved with them know a lot about those communities, and they know a lot about how to get that stakeholder buy-in to get other people involved. So it's a land example, but like one really great example of a really successful one, I don't know if you've heard of the Black Mambas, and they're a group of all-women anti-poaching people, and they have gone out and they not only are they working to stop poachers, but they're also working to educate local communities about some of the negative impacts of poaching. And they found that in areas where they are educating the kids, they're not even talking to the adults at all, but they go into the schools and they educate the kids, and they're finding less poaching happening in those areas where they've been able to go in and educate. So I don't know exactly what that looks like for rhino rays, but there are examples of other projects that are working within those local communities, using people from those communities to run these programs and get buy-in from everyone within the community.
How does one sign up for the reviewing those videos and helping with that?
I wish we were taking volunteers right now. We're not currently taking volunteers. We do still have a small team of volunteers that's working on this, but because most of the data has been analyzed already, we want to make sure that the scientists will be able to get back into the field collecting more videos before we bring on more people to watch the videos. So, but keep an eye on the aquarium website, because if we ever do open it up, that's where it'll show up.
I can also say there are other community science programs out there. So, for example,
You're not on the mic. Yeah, there are. Emily's saying there also are a lot of other community science.
Yeah, there's even like programs where you watch videos of penguin colonies, and you watch penguins all day, and it's the same kind of thing, and it's very popular, and those scientists do different types of analysis about penguin colonies, but you get really ground truth data when you can actually see the images. And so there's all kinds of different community science programs. The aquarium isn't always affiliated with all of them, but if the thing that I like about community science is that you can really engage. You can get published in Nature. You can get, that's so validating to know that you contributed so meaningfully. And to Layla's point earlier, when we talk about engaging people at young ages, that's what it takes, right? It just takes the moment of engagement where they say, I can do this. I see myself as someone who can do this, and I'll stay interested, right? And I think that's why community science is so accessible and so successful in a lot of ways.
I mean, Emily, you brought out something really important point. Publishing in Nature is a huge deal. It's the oldest scientific journal. The two best scientific journals are Nature and Science. Typically, if you're a university professor and you get one paper in Nature, you get tenure. It's like so to be a part of something, it means things only get in there if they're thought to be a globally significant contribution to science. So it is a huge deal. And, it's just,
Thank you.
it is incredible accomplishment. All right, I have one for here. How many different species of sharks are there?
There's over 400 different species of sharks and over 500 different species of stingrays.
I had another one of my geeky, nerdy questions.
Yeah.
And the fine scale of the data, the way it was collected, could you assign some of your surveys, your data to particular small island developing states?
What do you mean by that?
So there's a collection of small islands in the Pacific, the tropics, called small island developing states.
Okay.
And it's a United Nations definition. There's like 100 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have huge, exclusive economic zones. I just wondered how many of them fell into your study.
Oh, interesting.
And were your data attributed to the exclusive economic zone of small islands?
So each of our, the brevs that was placed has the coordinates attached to it. So I don't know specifically which of those they may have been sampling at. But that's something a scientist could go back at and, using that database, pull the data from those particular, thenything falling within those coordinates and do like a finer scale analysis.
That would be because there's, they so fit your model, and it's like 100 different units to start to try to understand it.
Yeah.
It'd be terrific. I know it wasn't in the Nature paper, but I didn't know if the data allowed it. Other questions? I went back there and then you.
Is Global FinPrint looking also on the changes of climate change, then changing the migrational patterns of different shark species? Because I was thinking about how the population has lessened in Hawaii. Is that due to our waters warming and them basically picking different areas to be at?
So they're not tracking migration, and looking at migration would require looking at individual sharks, and we were looking more at shark populations. There is a great organization, the OSearch, that has tagged tons and tons of sharks and is able to track them, and that's actually a really interesting program because you can go onto their website and pick a shark and see where it is that they've traveled. So I'm not sure if any of their analysis will involve like changing migration patterns, but this particular study doesn't look at all at migration. It could look at other factors of climate change and see how that affects reefs, maybe reefs that have had more impacts from climate change and see how that impacts the sharks, but it's not able to look at the migration of those animals.
Go ahead, Val.
You mentioned that our current volunteer staff in this project is pretty much, well, not dead, but it's not doing anything right now because the data has already been collected. But what would it take for this aquarium to initiate that study of our local sharks? We have divers who I'm sure would love to be out there doing some filming. We have the volunteers who already have had the buy-in to doing a project like this. And as you have commented, it would be something entirely new in the shark study because the ones we have are the tropical sharks, but get to where we live and work on it.
I'm with you, Val. I'll be the snorkeler in the water, dropping the bruvs. I'm ready to be there. I think that would be really interesting. I think, though, we are really fortunate to have here in Long Beach the Shark Lab at Cal State Long Beach, and they do so much great research on what's happening in our local waters. And I think that that there are probably reasons that they have selected the methods that they're using for studying sharks, and they're doing a lot of really great work right now here.
I mean, I think as Erin indicated, whenever we're usually doing this with partners. We don't do this, I mean, we're almost always doing these community science things often with partners. So don't do it on our own.
I'm with you, though, Val. You get the boat, I'll get the wetsuit. We got this covered.
Well, that was one of the thoughts behind the lifeguards. They're out there every day in their boats. They're out there on the feet in the sand and the water and up the estuaries. So, there's an automatic source of information right there, kind of a Mr. Outside, Mr. Inside type thing. So we'll see how that goes together.
Any other? Well, I want to thank you. I'm sorry I just get so into that research. Sharks are so important. They are one of the biggest conservation problems, and they're, what you guys did and other projects like that, they can make such a difference, and it's just very cool. So I talk too much.
It's an exciting project. I've been really, really fortunate to be involved with it.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.